Failures, I've had a few. Dealing with setbacks in academic life. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about three issues that often concern both academics and students. And those are, firstly, getting a PhD, secondly, getting published, and thirdly, and probably most difficult of the three, getting grants. So, the first of them, getting a PhD. Well, some of you might actually think, why on earth would you actually bother getting a PhD, or trying to get a PhD? Because it can take so long. It took me 10 years part-time to get a PhD. The shortest period you can get a PhD in is 3 years. So if you're doing a PhD, as many academics do, part-time, it's going to take you often 4.5, 5 years plus. Of course, unless that is you do a PhD by publication or a PhD by professional practice, which you can do in a shorter time period. But you have already to have done a lot of work to get either of those PhDs. Do you actually really need a PhD? Well, here is Padmal de Silva, who was a colleague of mine at the Institute of Psychiatry in London. Padmal was a world authority in a number of different conditions: obsessive-compulsive disorder, panic disorder, morbid jealousy, and Buddhism. He never had a PhD. So he never got higher than a senior lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry. But it didn't stop him having a worldwide reputation. So why was I interested in getting a PhD? Well, partly because my mother had been to see a fortune teller in Ireland, and I was the eldest of 5 children, and the fortune teller told my mother, 2 of your children will become doctors. So that gave me a 40% chance of becoming a doctor. So I thought, worth going for. Unfortunately, the fortune teller didn't say they'd be the poorer type of doctors, PhDs, as opposed to MDs, proper doctors, who get paid lots of money. But today's story really begins in a car park in Milton Keynes at the Open University. Well, in truth, this isn't actually a car park at Milton Keynes. It's just a car park I managed to find on the web. And I was sitting in my Volkswagen Golf car in tears, on my own. The reason I was in tears is because I just had a PhD supervision session with my 2 supervisors. And they said to me, well, Jerome, you've been doing this PhD for over 3 years. You're actually not getting anywhere. Here's the choice. You either stop now and give up, or you actually take a year out and come back and put a bit more effort in. So I was pretty devastated. I really thought I ought to give up. So part of that grief, those tears, were the fact that I actually had to give up. And I actually left the PhD. Now, why had I actually failed in the first place? Well, maybe it's because I was in an asylum at the time. Though, like other people, I have to say, like our actor friend earlier, who told us he was in prison, but he wasn't actually in prison. He was doing a production in prison. I was actually working in an asylum as a clinical psychologist. I was probably the only one out of hundreds of staff that was actually doing a PhD. So it wasn't really a research culture. I picked the wrong subject to study, which was social skills training, quite a boring area. And I was trying to apply social skills with some of the most disabled people in that hospital. So in essence, it was a project doomed to fail, and fail it actually did. So, fall down, get back up. So how did I get back up after that setback? Well, I discovered the value of conducting research, and I got really interested in carrying out research projects in the hospital. We did one project, for example, where we surveyed the entire hospital, and we discovered that when trusts were coming into the hospital to take patients away, because the hospital was going to close, they were taking the best patients first. This empirical discovery led the hospital to change its policy, and wards were allocated to the different trusts, so that they just couldn't go in and pick out the best people, as it were, for themselves. So, having really got interested in research, the specialism I was working in at the time was an area called psychiatric rehabilitation. And I had heard about this psychiatrist, Dr. Frank Holloway, who worked in South London. And he'd actually written books. I'd never worked with someone who'd written books. So I was determined to go and try and work with him. And I managed to get a job with him in South London at the Institute of Psychiatry and Maudsley. Now, having moved there in 1992, it was an incredibly inspiring environment to be in. It was an environment where research was everywhere. So I really threw myself into research and published quite a lot of papers with other colleagues there. Within 5 years, a panel was convened to consider my claims to the title of senior lecturer. And when I went into that panel, there was about 8 professors in there. The first thing they said to me was, just to reassure you, you've actually got your senior lectureship. So then sat down and they proceeded to ask me questions. But one of the things was that they said to me was, you will never be more than a senior lecturer unless you get a PhD. Whoops, I'd already been down that route and hadn't succeeded. And here these people are saying, unless you get one, you're not going to succeed anymore in this environment. So I decided to start a PhD the second time. This time, however, I was careful to choose the right area. Now, it was an area that I had already co-edited 2 books on. I had 17 peer-reviewed papers and 9 professional papers as well. And this was the area of occupational stress. Now, those of you that may not know about PhDs will not know there's no exams to sit with a PhD. There's actually only 2 elements to a PhD. There is first the production of the thesis, and then there is an interview with 2 people in Britain typically, who ask you about your thesis, and you have to defend your thesis to them. Sounds actually very easy, but it is incredibly difficult. And anyone who's been through a viva will know how difficult that actually is. And it's a bit like going to face a couple of gunslingers. Because you'll have an external examiner who is a specialist in the field and knows lots about that area. And sometimes you'll be lucky and have an internal examiner who is probably a friend of your supervisor, who's not going to be too difficult. Unfortunately, I didn't get an internal examiner like that. I got a very ferocious Scottish, and I say Scottish because I can see Brian in the wings there, a very ferocious Scottish academic. And normally internals are gentle. She was anything gentle but gentle with me. And there's the outcome. So we had arranged a celebration because I was supremely overconfident that I'd get a PhD. And we got the champagne and the meal. Well, I didn't want to drink the champagne. I ate the food, it tasted awful. Steak, chips and sweet corn, my favorite. And I ended up going to bed at 10 o'clock at night, totally disconsolate. What was even worse was the outcome of the viva. They said, you need to make major changes. We're going to give you 18 months to do it. And furthermore, we want to give you another viva. Now, I'd never heard of this outcome. I'd thought you either passed or you failed. I didn't realize there was this intermediate stage where you might actually have to have another Viva. So, 18 months later, had the reviva, passed, had the champagne, got the certificate, got the PhD. Now, I was told you are not going to go any higher without a PhD. What went right? So, right subject, right participants, right research environment. But becoming Dr. Carson didn't prove as easy as I actually thought it would be. So each of these eminent psychiatrists all had a say in my future. And the first people I went to see were Professor Sir David Goldberg and Professor Anthony Mann. And they looked at my CV and said, you've not been publishing much lately, have you? That Lancet paper, oh dear, what a shame it was in 1997. It was now 2006, so it couldn't be counted in the 2008 research assessment exercise, which is what they were thinking about. Professor Smuckler, the chap in the extreme right, stopped me in the canteen one day and said, has anyone had a chat to you about your publications? Oh no. And then finally I got to see Professor Thornycroft, the chap at the bottom there, sitting very casually. And Professor Thornycroft said to me, you need to have 4 papers with you as the first author, all in journals with an impact factor of greater than 3. With the exception of the Lancet paper, I don't think any of my papers had ever been in journals with an impact factor of greater than 3. So I made some attempts to try and actually recover the situation, but unfortunately I was unsuccessful. And perhaps the greatest insult was I sent a paper to the Journal of Advanced Nursing where I already had 4 or 5 papers in that journal, and it was rejected without even being sent for review. And what was even worse, it only had an impact factor of 1. So they said to me, you are going to have to transfer to the trust and work full-time for the NHS, but you can keep your title as honorary senior lecturer if you have been a fully blown senior lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry. You do not want to drop your status to honorary. Honorary is for people who have never been a senior lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry, but often have a medical qualification and are given honorary status because they give the occasional lecture. So recovery became part of my recovery. And I published a number of books with people who have mental health problems, and these are 3 of them here. However, putting so much work into recovery actually led me to a state of burnout. And at the age of 54, I took early retirement from the NHS. And you get a lump sum. I got a lump sum of £75,000, and I blew £5,000 on a party. It was worth it. I didn't have a single drink. I was too hyper to even have a single drink at the actual party. So after a year at home, trying to survive on an NHS pension of £21,000, I realised the math didn't work there. So I was forced to get another job. By a miracle of God, I ended up as Professor of Psychology at the University of Bolton. How did that happen? I don't know how that happened, but I can't tell you how delighted I am to be Professor of Psychology at the University of Bolton, because it's the most wonderful place to actually work. Though I'm sure most people say that about their own universities. So getting a PhD for me helped me get the professorship. And I probably wouldn't have got the professorship without the PhD. So very important to get that PhD. Getting published. Ian McMillan and I do publication workshops. And when I was at this period of semi-retirement, he said, would you write an article for me? I'll give you £100. I said, I'll write it for nothing, but I'll take the check anyway. And the article started, writing for publication is easy. Ooh, bold start. Sometimes it helps when you're writing to start positively. When the paper actually came out, he changed it to, writing for publication is easier than you think. Wonderful. He actually improved what I'd actually said. Now, some of our learned colleagues here, Dr. Matsoukas, Dr. Marie Norman, Neil Duggan, and I've come up with a number of tips on writing for publication. 12 simple tips there. Probably the most important tip I can actually give you is passion. Write about something that you feel passionate about, because then the words will flow if it's something you feel passionate about. Of course, there are different types of journals. Don't start with the Lancet. The Lancet has a 95% rejection rate. Yes, Mum would love to see your paper in the Lancet, but unfortunately, very few people ever get to see their papers in the Lancet because it's so incredibly hard to get in. You get used to rejection when it comes to submitting journal papers. And in fact, after we revised one paper and we sent it back to a journal, the reviewer said, I never want to see this paper again. Well, needless to say, we didn't send it to them again. They wouldn't have it anyway. But we ended up sending it nowhere else. An occupational therapist who did a master's degree was advised by his supervisors to submit his paper to the British Journal of Occupational Therapy. It was reviewed by 3 people. It was rejected. He was so disappointed, he never submitted another paper for 15 years. So what you have to bear in mind is every academic gets papers rejected. Everyone has actually had rejections. So maybe try something easier. Try doing a book review. The joy of doing a book review is you get to keep the books. Write a letter to the editor. Research has been done on the Psychologist magazine, and there's a whole variety of different types of articles. It turns out the thing the psychologists like to read most are the letters pages, bless them. And the reason for that is because it's where they're all having a go at each other. So it's actually very interesting, and you can't write anything that's more than 200 words. So they're all very short, and most of us, with the attention spans of gnats, can actually manage that type of thing. And bear in mind as well, as Professor Eysenck said, journals need papers. Without papers, there's no journals. So some journal somewhere is waiting for your paper. You just don't know which journal it is at the moment, but trust me, it's there waiting for you. So my third and final point is about getting grants. This is Professor Geoffrey Gray, one of the most eminent psychologists in the world. He told me he only succeeded in 1 out of 10 grants. 1 out of 10. Yanis, what chance does that give us if one of the greatest people in the world can only get 1 out of 10? It means we probably need to start small, go for small pots of money, and slowly build up. Don't go for the big things. So let me just conclude then. Failures, I've probably had more than a few. But we all have to deal with setbacks in academic life. The boxer Nicola Adams, the first woman to ever win an Olympic gold for boxing in 2012 in London, and again 2016 in Rio. Two Olympic golds, said, fall down 8 times, get up 9. Thank you very much for your attention.